What does it mean when a teenage peasant girl from a village no one had heard of walks into the court of a failing king, tells him she has been sent by God to save his country, and then proceeds to do exactly that? In 1429, France was a country in the process of ceasing to exist. It had been at war for nearly a century. Its territory was divided between the English and their Burgundian allies. Its king was uncrowned and widely regarded as illegitimate, and its population had endured generations of war, plague, and famine without any credible prospect of relief. Tonight I am here with Rowan Hardsteel.
Good evening, Clara.
Into this crisis came Joan of Arc. She was probably 17 when she arrived at the royal court at Chinon. She had no military training, no political standing, no social position, and no credential beyond the absolute certainty of her own conviction that she had been commanded by God to do what she was doing. Tonight, we turn to a life that changed the course of a war, ended in a fire at the age of 19, and became one of the most enduring symbols of courage and conviction in European history. The question is not only who Joan of Arc was, but what her story reveals about the relationship between individual conviction and historical possibility, and about what can happen when a person acts with total certainty, in a situation where everyone else has accepted that nothing can be done.
History is sometimes changed by people who should never have had the power to change it. Joan of Arc is the most striking example of this in European medieval history. A peasant girl with no education, no social standing, and no institutional authority became the decisive figure in a conflict between two of the most powerful kingdoms of the age. The mechanism by which this happened is not mysterious. It is one of the most human things that history offers.
We are speaking about Joan of Arc, born around 1412 in Domremy, a village in the Duchy of Bar in northeastern France, executed at Rouen on the 30th of May 1431, at approximately 19 years of age, and one of the most consequential figures in the history of France.
She was canonized by the Catholic Church in 1920, nearly 5 centuries after her death. The trial that condemned her was formally annulled 25 years after her execution, when her own judges had to acknowledge that the process had been conducted in violation of canon law. She is now the patron saint of France. All of this began with a girl who could not read, who had never left her village, and who heard voices telling her to save her country.
Then, let us begin with the France she was born into, and with what the crisis of her time actually felt like.
The 100 Years' War, which had been ongoing since 1337, was by Joan's birth not a single sustained conflict, but a series of campaigns, truces, and renewed hostilities that had reshaped France into a patchwork of competing loyalties, devastated territories, and exhausted populations. The English, under Henry V, had won the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 and forced France to sign the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which recognized the English king as heir to the French throne and effectively dispossessed the Dauphin Charles of his birthright. Domremy, Joan's village, sat on a border area contested between the Burgundians, who were allied with England, and the Armagnacs, who supported the Dauphin. The village was raided repeatedly during her childhood. She grew up in a world where the violence of war was not abstract but immediate, where uncertainty was the defining feature of daily life, and where the institutions that might have provided stability, the church, the pech, nobility, the monarchy, were either compromised or absent.
So she was formed by a world of genuine danger, not by the sheltered life that her later legend sometimes implies.
Yes, and here is the first thing we need to correct about the standard account. Joan of Arc is often presented as a simple, naive girl elevated by miraculous divine intervention into an impossible situation. The historical record shows something more complex. A young person of unusual psychological strength, clarity of purpose and social intelligence, who understood the political landscape of her time well enough to navigate it with considerable skill, and whose visions, whatever their ultimate nature, provided her with a framework of absolute certainty that was itself a form of power in a world paralyzed by uncertainty. Joan reported that she began hearing voices around the age of 13. She identified them as Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. The voices told her progressively that she had a mission: to see the Dauphin crowned at Reims, the traditional site of French royal coronations, and to drive the English from France. The historian's task in approaching these visions is neither to assert their miraculous character nor to dismiss them as symptoms of psychological disturbance, both of which would be anachronistic. The visions were real to Joan. They gave her a mandate she experienced as absolute. This certainty was the foundation of everything that followed. In January 1429, Joan left Domremy, She was approximately 17. She had never traveled beyond her immediate region, had no military experience, and had no letters of introduction or political connections. She traveled to Vaucouleurs and persuaded the local military commander, Robert de Baudricourt, after multiple rejections, to give her an escort to the royal court at Chinon. She crossed several hundred kilometers of territory, controlled partly by hostile forces, to reach the Dauphin.
So the journey to the Dauphin was itself an act of extraordinary determination before anything else had happened.
Yes. Her examination at Poitiers, where a commission of theologians and court officials questioned her for several weeks to assess whether her mission was genuine or diabolically inspired, is one of the more revealing episodes in her story. She answered the theologians with a directness that the commission's record shows they found disarming. She was not theologically sophisticated. She did not construct elaborate arguments. She stated her position simply and maintained it without deviation. This was not naivety. It was the product of absolute conviction, and it was persuasive in a way that theological subtlety would not have been. The lifting of the siege of Orleans in April and May of 1429 was the military turning point that validated Joan's mission in the eyes of the French court, the French army, and the French population. Orleans had been under English siege for 7 months. Its fall would have opened the Loire Valley and probably ended organized French resistance. Joan arrived with the relief army, insisted on a more aggressive strategy than the commanders had been pursuing, and within 9 days the English had abandoned the siege.
So the military effect was real, not simply symbolic.
Yes. Joan's military role is often either exaggerated into tactical genius or minimized into mere morale boosting. The historical record suggests something more specific. She was not a trained strategist. She did not manage complex logistics or devise innovative formations. What she did was insist on boldness at moments when her commanders were inclined toward caution, demonstrate a willingness to be physically present in the most dangerous situations, suffer wounds and continue, and project an absolute confidence that transformed the psychology of an army that had been losing for so long that it had begun to believe defeat was inevitable. The Loire campaign that followed Orleans, which cleared the English from a series of fortified towns in rapid succession, and the march to Reims in the summer of 1429, which took Joan's army through territory it should not have been able to cross without major engagements, demonstrated that the military momentum created at Orleans was real and sustainable. In July 1429, Charles VII was crowned King of France at Reims Cathedral, with Joan standing beside him holding her standard.
So she accomplished what she had promised, the coronation at Reims.
Yes, the coronation was the symbolic peak of her mission, and, in retrospect, also the beginning of her political marginalization. With Charles crowned, the court's immediate need for her diminished. She was no longer the only hope of a failing regime, but a potentially difficult figure in a newly constituted court that was developing its own political calculations, including the possibility of negotiating with the Burgundy rather than continuing a military campaign. Joan continued to campaign, but the momentum of the summer of 1429 was not sustained. A failed assault on Paris in September was repulsed, and the campaign stalled. In May 1430, while defending the town of Compiègne against a Burgundian siege, Joan's retreat was cut off by a Burgundian force, and she was captured. She was sold to the English by her Burgundian captors for 10,000 livres. Her king made no effort to ransom or rescue her. The political landscape of France in 1429 requires some additional context to understand why Joan's arrival at court was not immediately dismissed. Charles VII was a figure of genuinely uncertain legitimacy. Rumors promoted by his Burgundian enemies suggested he might be illegitimate, the son not of the previous French king but of a court favorite. His failure to be crowned at Reims, the traditional site where French kings received sacred authority, left his claim to the throne incomplete in a way that mattered in the political and religious culture of the era.
Joan's mission to crown Charles at Reims was not simply symbolic. It was politically essential for his legitimacy.
Yes. This is one reason the court was willing to take the risk of trusting a peasant girl with a vision. The alternative was to continue with a king whose legitimacy was contested, an army whose morale was broken, and a military situation that was deteriorating by the year. The cost of believing Joan was low compared to the cost of continuing without. She was not trusted blindly. She was tested at Poitiers, examined carefully and given a relatively minor initial role. What she did with it created the conditions for the trust that followed. Joan's role as a symbol during her own lifetime was already considerable, and was deliberately cultivated. She adopted a recognizable visual identity, white armor, a distinctive standard bearing an image of Christ in judgment, and the white horse that appears in multiple contemporary accounts. These were not incidental details. They were elements of a public presentation calculated to project both divine favor and military authority. Joan understood at some level that she was as much a symbol as a soldier, and that the symbol could achieve things the soldier alone could not.
So she was aware of her own symbolic function, and used it deliberately.
Yes, the answer she gave when asked at her trial why her standard was brought into the coronation ceremony at Reims is one of the most revealing things she ever said. She replied that it had borne the burden, and it was only right that it should share in the honor. This is not the response of someone who was unaware of the political and symbolic dimensions of what she was doing. It is the response of someone who understood them with unusual precision. The treatment of Joan's gender in her own time was complex. Her wearing of male clothing was the charge that proved most durable in her trial, partly because it was the most difficult to refute, and partly because it was the most viscerally disturbing to the ecclesiastical culture of the period. She maintained consistently that she wore male clothing because her mission required it, that it was more practical for military life, and that her voices had instructed her to do so. The court found this claim both legally problematic and morally offensive, in ways that her military activities did not quite achieve.
So, the charge that ultimately condemned her most effectively was not heresy in the theological sense, but the transgression of gender boundaries.
Yes. And this detail illuminates something important about how power operates in relation to gender. Joan's military success, her political influence, and her theological claims all disturbed the existing order. But the charge that the court found it easiest to sustain, and that the broader culture found most comprehensible as a basis for condemnation, was the visible disruption of the category that should have contained her. The armor, the short hair, the male clothing. These were the violation that could be seen and named in ways that her battlefield effectiveness could not.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, for those who want to understand Joan's life in its full historical and human complexity, where would you invite them to continue in?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with Joan of Arc, a history by Helen Tastor.
So, this is a biography that approaches Joan as a historical figure, rather than as a legend.
Castor provides a deeply researched and vivid account of Joan's life, military role, trial, and enduring legacy, showing how a teenage peasant girl became one of history's most extraordinary figures. The book is notable for situating Joan fully within the specific political and military context of the 100 Years' War, which makes her choices and her fate comprehensible in ways that accounts focused primarily on her spiritual dimension do not always achieve.
Is it accessible to readers without prior knowledge of medieval French history?
Castor is an exceptionally clear writer who builds her historical context carefully and does not assume specialist knowledge. The book reads as a narrative of a life, rather than as an academic treatise, which means a reader coming to Joan for the first time will find it both informative and engaging. It is the book I would give to anyone who wanted to understand Joan of Arc beyond the icon.
So it gives the reader the person behind the symbol.
Precisely. And Castor is honest about the limits of the evidence, about what cannot be known, which makes the portrait she constructs more credible rather than less.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
The trial of Joan of Arc, conducted at Rouen from January to May 1431, under the authority of the Bishop of Beauvais, Pierre Jean, was one of the most politically motivated ecclesiastical proceedings of all the medieval period. The English needed to delegitimize both Joan and, through her, the coronation of Charles VII. A charge of heresy, if sustained, would retroactively void the sacred character of the ceremony she had made possible. The charges brought against her included heresy witchcraft, wearing men's clothing in violation of ecclesiastical law, and claiming to receive direct divine guidance in a manner that bypassed the authority of the. The trial record, which survives in considerable detail, shows Joan answering her interrogators with a consistency and composure that frustrated the court's attempts to trap her in contradictions. Her answers to complex theological questions were often direct to the point of ingenuity.
So she defended herself as effectively as anyone without formal education could have done.
Yes. When asked whether she believed she was in a state of grace, a question designed to trap her because saying yes would be heretical presumption, and saying no would be a confession. She replied, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." The court had no adequate response to this. Her imprisonment was severe. She was held in chains in a military prison, rather than in the ecclesiastical custody that canon law required, guarded by male soldiers, and subjected to extended periods of isolation and psychological pressure. Under the sustained pressure of the trial and the threat of death, Joan made a brief recantation, signing a document in which she acknowledged that her voices were false and her mission unfounded. Within days she retracted the recantation, resuming male clothing and asserting that her voices had been real. This retraction sealed her fate. She was declared a relapsed heretic, handed to the secular authorities, and on May 30, 1431, burned in the marketplace of Rouen. Contemporary accounts of her final hours describe her asking for a cross to be held before her eyes, expressing concern for the souls of those around her, and maintaining her composure until the end. She was 19 years old. The English soldiers and officials who were present, several of whom later gave testimony that was used in the rehabilitation trial, described witnessing something that disturbed them deeply. Articulate exactly what it was.
So even those who presided over her execution recognized that something significant had happened.
Yes. 25 years after her execution, in 1456, Pope Calixtus III authorized a retrial. The rehabilitation process examined the original trial record, and found that it had been conducted in violation of multiple provisions of canon law, including the failure to provide Joan with proper legal counsel and the improper conditions of her imprisonment. The original verdict was annulled. The process did not restore her life, but it restored her reputation, and transformed her from a convicted heretic into a martyr. The longer historical legacy of Joan of Arc is as much a story about symbol as about history. She has been claimed by French nationalism, by the Catholic Church, by feminism, by royalism, and by the political left. Each appropriation has emphasized a different dimension of her story. The nationalist appropriation emphasizes her role in driving out the English. The feminist appropriation emphasizes her defiance of gender convention. Each finds something genuine in the historical record, because the historical Joan was genuinely all of these things.
So her legacy is partly a history of what each era needed her to be.
Yes, and this is characteristic of the most powerful historical symbols. They are complex enough to sustain multiple appropriations without being reducible to any one of them. The historical Joan was a peasant girl who heard voices, acted on what she believed was a divine mandate, changed the course of a war, and was executed by the political forces she had defeated. The simplicity of those facts is not diminished by the complexity of what they meant to subsequent generations. The conclusion her story most directly supports is that conviction can alter the course of nations even when it cannot save the person who carries it. Joan did not survive her mission. The France she helped save did not save her. The king she crowned made no effort to rescue her. The church that later canonized her had burned her. And yet the transformation she brought about was real and lasting. The English were eventually expelled from France. Charles VII's legitimacy, which her coronation had established, was never successfully challenged. The 100 Years' War ended in French victory in 1453.
So the change she brought about outlasted the injustice done to her.
Yes, and this is what makes her story so persistent. It is not a story about justice because justice was not done to Joan of Arc in her lifetime. It is a story about the relationship between individual conviction and historical possibility. About what becomes conceivable when someone acts with total certainty in a situation where everyone else has concluded nothing can be done. The mechanism is not miraculous. It is recognizably human, and it has appeared in different forms in different centuries, which is why the story does not feel old.
Thank you for staying with us tonight, and thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the devastated France that produced her, the voices she heard, the siege she lifted, the coronation she made possible, and the fire that could not stop what she had already set in motion.
Joan of Arc reminds us that history is sometimes changed by people who should never have had the power to change it, and that the most disruptive thing a person can bring to a paralyzed world is the refusal to accept that nothing can be done.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.